It's a Saturday morning, you woke up early, the coffee is perfect, the weather outside is genuinely nice for once. You've got absolutely nothing on your schedule. You walk to your front door, open it, take a deep breath of fresh air, and there it is. Thinking maybe it's a community newsletter? Maybe a block party announcement. It's a violation notice. $75. Due within 30 days. You look around your property, completely confused. Everything looks fine. You look at the notice again. You read the violation description carefully. Your garden hose was left coiled on the driveway between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. on a Wednesday. This is in violation of Section 4, subsection 1(2)(b) of the HOA Community Standards regarding visible outdoor equipment. Your garden hose. Pause. Let it land. Now, most people in that moment would feel one of two things. Either complete and total rage, the kind that makes your hands shake, or they'd laugh because surely this is a joke. Surely no grown adult with a full life and real responsibilities spent their evening peering through a window, clocking your garden hose, and then typed up an official legal document about it. But here's the thing, these people exist in enormous numbers, all across America, in tidy little cul-de-sacs and manicured subdivisions. There are people who have decided, without anyone asking them, that it is their personal mission to enforce, interpret, and weaponize a set of neighborhood rules against their own neighbors. We call them HOA Karens. But here's the thing, these people exist in enormous numbers. All across America, in tidy little cul-de-sacs and manicured subdivisions, there are people who have decided, without anyone asking them, that it is their personal mission to enforce, interpret, and weaponize a set of neighborhood rules against their own neighbors. We call them HOA Karens. Lean forward. Build energy. Now, before we get into it, I want you to understand something. Every single story in this video ends with the Karen losing. I want you to hold on to that, because some of these stories get dark before they get good. Some of these people went through months, even years of being harassed, fined, threatened, and belittled by someone who lived 20 feet away from them. But they all won. Every single one of them. And the way they won? It's going to make you incredibly happy. Let's get into it. Our first story comes from a Reddit user who goes by Front Yard Freedom, and he posted this story in r Petty Justice about 2 years ago. It currently has over 47,000 upvotes, which tells you everything you need to know about how relatable this is. He and his wife had just bought their first home. Classic American dream stuff. Decent neighborhood, good school district, quiet street. The house needed a little work, but nothing crazy. They moved in on a Friday, and by Monday, literally by Monday, they had a violation notice in their mailbox. The grass was too long. Specifically, the HOA rulebook stated that residential lawns must be maintained at no more than 3.5 inches. According to the notice, his lawn had been measured at 3.8 inches. 3.8 inches. Now, he hadn't even fully unpacked yet. His couch was still in the garage. He had boxes stacked in every room. He had not, understandably, made lawn maintenance his top priority during the first 48 hours of homeownership. So he mowed the lawn. Fine, whatever. He figured it was a one-time thing. New neighborhood, new rules, he'd just stay on top of it. No problem. Except the following Monday, there was another notice. This time it was about a tiny patch near the fence line that he'd missed 0.3 inches over the limit. Caught by a woman named Linda. Meet Linda. Linda was a retired school teacher who had lived on the street for 11 years. She had been on the HOA board for 9 of those 11 years. She had never, in those 9 years, held any title other than enforcement coordinator, a title, by the way, that she had given herself. Hobbies of any conventional kind. What Linda had was a clipboard, a retractable measuring tape, and a very specific Monday morning routine. Every single Monday, between 7:30 and 9 o'clock in the morning, Linda would walk the full perimeter of every property on the street and measure any lawn that she felt looked questionable. She had been doing this for years. Most people just quietly complied because they didn't realize they had any other option. Our guy, though, was not the quietly complying type. He started mowing every Sunday evening, right before dark, to make sure he was under the limit by Monday morning. This worked for about 3 weeks. Then, Linda started coming on Sunday afternoons instead. He started mowing Sunday afternoons. Linda started coming Saturday evenings. This went on for 3 months. A genuine arms race over grass. His wife was ready to list the house. His blood pressure was through the roof. He had spent more time thinking about his lawn in 3 months than he had in his entire life combined. And then one night, unable to sleep, he did something that changed everything. He read the HOA rulebook, the entire thing, cover to cover. The discovery, and buried in Section 7, Subsection 3, Paragraph C, which honestly nobody reads, he found it. All property inspections conducted by HOA enforcement personnel must be preceded by written notification delivered to the homeowner, no fewer than 48 hours prior to the inspection date and time. 48 hours notice. Written notification. Required. Every time. Linda had never once given him notice. Not a single time in 3 months. She had just shown up, measured things, and issued fines. Which meant that every single fine she had ever issued him, and he suspected every fine she had ever issued anyone, was procedurally invalid. He didn't say anything to Linda. He didn't confront her. Then instead, he bought a trail camera and mounted it on his fence, pointed directly at the front sidewalk. Then he waited. Linda showed up 2 days later. No notice. Measuring tape out, clipboard ready. He had her on video. He then requested, through a formal written process he found described in the rulebook, a complete history of all fines issued to his address. The total came to $2,950 over 3 months. Every single one of them issued without proper notice. He filed a formal grievance with the County HOA Regulatory Board, submitted the video evidence, submitted the fine history, and submitted a written legal argument that every fine violated Section 7, Subsection 3. The county board agreed. All fines were dismissed. Linda was formally reprimanded, and because she had been conducting unauthorized inspections as a self-appointed position with no official board authority, she was removed from her so-called role entirely. The ending. At the next community meeting, which, for the first time in years, had significant attendance, the board officially abolished the enforcement coordinator position. Several other neighbors came forward to say they'd been fined under the same circumstances and requested their money back, too. Linda attended the meeting. She sat in the back row. She did not speak. Our guy later said that he considered just leaving things there. But then he thought about it more and decided that closure required one more gesture. So he put together a small gift basket, some fruit, some local jam, a small potted plant, and left it on Linda's doorstep with a handwritten card. The card said, "Gardening is surprisingly therapeutic. You should really try it sometime. Your neighbor." Linda never spoke to him directly again. His lawn, by his own admission, is now occasionally a bit long. This comes from you, Christmas Rebel Dad, and I want you to pay close attention to the timeline here because the detail matters. He lived in his HOA community for 6 years. Good neighbor. Paid dues on time. Never had a complaint. Every December he put up Christmas lights. Not crazy lights. Just a clean, simple string of warm white LEDs along the roofline and around the front windows. The kind of lights that literally every house on every street in America has had at some point. He liked Christmas. His kids liked Christmas. The lights went up November 20th every year and came down January 10th. It was a tradition. Enter Deborah. Deborah moved in across the street in October of the year this story takes place. Deborah was, by all accounts, an intense person. She had very specific aesthetic opinions. She believed in what she called neighborhood visual harmony, which is a phrase she apparently used frequently and without irony. On November 21st, one day after the lights went up, Deborah knocked on his door. She introduced herself, complimented his home, and then informed him, pleasantly but firmly, that she found his Christmas lights too commercially aggressive for the neighborhood's aesthetic standard. He thanked her for introducing herself and closed the door. On November 23rd, Deborah filed her first formal complaint with the HOA board, citing the lights as a community nuisance. On November 27th, Deborah filed her second complaint, this time with photographs she had taken from her own front window. On December 1st, Deborah circulated a handwritten petition to every house on the block, asking residents to sign in support of maintaining visual standards during the holiday season. She reportedly knocked on 17 doors over 2 evenings. 3 people signed, 14 did not. On December 3rd, he received a letter from the HOA board informing him that his lights were under review and requesting that he voluntarily remove them pending a board decision. He opens the rulebook. Now, at this point, a lot of people would have just taken the lights down. It's not worth the fight, right? They're just lights. But he had 6 years of good standing and he was curious, so he pulled out the HOA rulebook. Section 9. Holiday decorations. Seasonal holiday decorations are permitted on all residential properties from November 15th through January 15th. No restrictions are placed on decoration type, quantity, color, or display method within this period. No restrictions on type, quantity, color, or display method. Deborah had not read the rulebook. The HOA board apparently had not read it either before sending that letter. His lights were 100% within the rules. There was nothing anyone could do. He wrote back to the board, quoted Section 9 in full, and stated clearly that he would not be removing his lights and that any further action against him would be in direct violation of the community's own governing documents. The board went quiet. Deborah did not. She filed 2 more complaints in the following week. Both were dismissed. She reportedly called a board member at home on a Sunday evening. She sent a group email to everyone whose address she could find, describing the lights as an assault on the senses, the escalation. And here is where our guy, a patient, reasonable man who had absorbed weeks of this, made a decision. He was going to redecorate. Pause, build anticipation. He spent one weekend in mid-December executing what he later described in his Reddit post as a carefully considered response. By December 20th, his house had 52,000 individual LED lights covering every surface of the exterior. The roofline, the gutters, the window frames, the porch columns, the fence, 2 large trees in the front yard, and the driveway border. He added an 8-foot inflatable Santa on the roof, 2 6-foot inflatable snow globes on the lawn, a projector casting animated snowflakes across the front of the house, and, the crowning achievement, a synchronized light show set to Christmas music that ran every hour on the hour from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. His house was visible from a considerable distance. Multiple neighbors came out to watch the first night the full display ran. People stopped their cars to look. Someone posted it on the local community Facebook group. Deborah's house, which sat directly across the street, was bathed in festive, joyful, legally permitted light every single evening for the rest of December. Deborah filed 4 more complaints, all dismissed. The board had stopped engaging. His display was covered by a local news segment about neighborhood holiday spirit. They filmed from the street. Deborah's house is visible in the background of several shots. The lights came down January 14th, one day before the deadline, exactly within the rules. By February, Deborah had listed her home for sale. She moved out in March. He still does the full display every year. The neighborhood, by all accounts, loves it. He said last year a family drove over from the next town specifically to see it. The first 2 stories involved harassment and annoyance. Chapter 3 involves actual financial damage, actual legal action, and one of the most satisfying courtroom-adjacent moments in this entire video. This comes from you, not our spot Karen, and it takes place in a condominium complex with an attached parking structure. Every unit in the complex had one assigned parking spot. His spot was clearly marked with his unit number. He had a parking permit. He had lived there for 4 years. He had never once had a parking issue. Meet Patricia. Patricia lived 2 floors above him. She was retired. She had strong opinions about the parking structure. She had, at some point in the past, decided to appoint herself the complex's unofficial parking enforcement officer. Now, the HOA had an actual parking management process. Residents could report violations through the management company, who would investigate and take appropriate action. Patricia had chosen not to use that process. Instead, Patricia had acquired a high-visibility reflective vest, a clipboard with official-looking paper, and the phone number of a local towing company that she had clearly established a working relationship with. She had, over the course of about a year, had approximately 14 vehicles towed from the complex. Some were genuine violations, visitors and resident spots, that sort of thing, but at least 4 of those tows, based on what emerged later, were completely unjustified. Our guy came out one Tuesday morning to drive to work. His car was not in his spot. He searched the structure for 20 minutes, thinking he'd parked in the wrong place. He hadn't. His car was gone. The tow. He called the towing company, listed on the structure's signage. His car had been called in the previous evening as an abandoned vehicle with no visible permit. His permit was hanging from his rearview mirror. It was visible from outside the car. The towing company had documentation showing who had called it in. He paid $400 to get his car out of impound. He missed a work meeting. He was furious when he confronted Patricia in the hallway calmly. He emphasized, she told him she was just maintaining community safety and that his permit looked expired from a distance. It was not expired. It had 8 months remaining. She was completely unbothered. As if $400 and a morning of his time was simply the acceptable cost of her performing a service for the community. The investigation. He went to the HOA management company and requested security footage from the night of the tow. The parking structure had cameras at both the entrance and along the main aisle. The footage showed Patricia, in her vest, clipboard in hand, walking up to his car, looking directly at the parking permit through the window, writing something on her clipboard, and then making a phone call. She had seen the permit. She had looked right at it. And she had called the tow anyway. He took the footage to the police and filed a report for fraudulent vehicle removal, essentially a form of vandalism or interference with personal property. The officer reviewing the case agreed it was worth pursuing. He then consulted a civil attorney who told him he had a very clean case, documented financial loss, video evidence showing intentional false reporting, and a pattern of behavior given the other residents who'd been towed. The resolution, he filed the civil suit. Patricia, through her own attorney, offered to settle before the case reached a hearing. The settlement covered his $400 towing fee, an additional $900 in damages for lost time and inconvenience, and $500 in legal fees. Total, $1,800, more than 4 times the original cost. As part of the settlement, Patricia was also required to send a written letter of apology to every resident she had towed or cited in the previous 12 months. The management company used this as an opportunity to formally document her pattern of unauthorized enforcement and issued a community-wide notice stating that no resident had any authority to call for vehicle removal. All violations must go through the management office. Patricia's vest and clipboard were not mentioned in the settlement documents, but he confirmed in a comment that she has not been seen wearing them since. He keeps a printed copy of the settlement in his glove compartment, just in case. Every story so far has featured someone who was new to the neighborhood or who kept to themselves, getting targeted by someone with a grudge and too much free time. Chapter 4 is a little different because this one has a state government involved. Garden Justice Warrior had lived in her home for 7 years. She was a good neighbor. She participated in community events. She knew most of the people on her street by name. In the spring, she decided to build a small raised vegetable garden in her backyard. She spent a weekend on it, 4 raised beds, good soil, a simple drip irrigation system. She planted tomatoes, bell peppers, zucchini, basil, and a few rows of lettuce. Nothing exotic, a very normal home garden. Her next-door neighbor, and I want to be very clear, her neighbor's name was actually Karen, watched the whole project from across the fence with visible displeasure. Karen objects. 3 days after the garden beds were completed, she received a letter from the HOA. Karen had filed a complaint claiming that the vegetable garden was, quote, agricultural in nature, incompatible with residential zoning expectations, likely to attract pest wildlife, and detrimental to surrounding property values. The letter gave her 30 days to remove the garden or face a $200 per day fine. She had spent $840 building it. She was, as you might imagine, extremely unhappy. She went to the next HOA meeting and argued her case. She pointed out that the garden was in her backyard, not visible from the street, completely within her property line and affecting no one. Karen attended the meeting. Karen had brought printed photographs. Karen had written a statement. Karen had, genuinely, prepared more thoroughly for this HOA meeting than most people prepare for job interviews. The board sided with Karen. They reiterated the 30-day removal deadline. The research. She went home furious. She spent that evening researching HOA law in her state specifically as it related to gardens and landscaping, and she found something remarkable. Her state, along with over a dozen others across the country, had passed what's known as a right to garden law. The specific statute in her state read, in part, that no HOA or community association may prohibit, restrict, or penalize a homeowner for maintaining a vegetable or herb garden on their own property, including in rear or side yards not visible from public streets. Not only was her garden within the rules, the rule they were trying to enforce against her was flatly, completely, unambiguously illegal under state law. The HOA had been enforcing a provision in their own rulebook that had been superseded by state legislation. Whether they knew this and didn't care, or simply hadn't updated their rulebook in years, didn't particularly matter. The rule was void. The letter. She drafted a formal response. She cited the statute by name and number. She included a printed copy of the relevant section. She noted that the fine structure they had threatened constituted an attempt to enforce an illegal provision, which could itself create liability for the board. She sent it to the board, CC'd a real estate attorney friend who agreed to put their name on the letter as a reviewer, and submitted it via certified mail with return receipt. The board responded within 48 hours. Full, written apology. The complaint was withdrawn. The HOA rulebook's garden restriction was formally repealed at the next board meeting and replaced with language that aligned with state law. Karen did not comment publicly. She did, however, begin installing what appeared to be motion-activated sprinklers near the shared fence line shortly afterward. But that's a story for another video. She left a small basket of her first tomato harvest on Karen's doorstep. No note, just tomatoes. She said it felt like the right move. Some stories on this list are funny, some are infuriating, some are deeply satisfying in a petty, tactical way. This one is different. This one made a lot of people angry for a very specific reason. Veteran not afraid, served 12 years in the United States military. He was deployed twice. He came home, built a career, bought a house, and when he moved in, he did what a lot of veterans do. He hung an American flag from his front porch. Not a massive flag, not a commercial-grade installation. A standard residential flagpole mount, a 3-by-5-foot flag, maintained properly and hung with care. His neighbors, by his account, never said a word about it. Several of them complimented it. Susan's letter. Susan was on the HOA board. Susan had been on the board for 4 years. Susan sent him a cease and desist letter 14 days after he moved in. The letter stated that his flag was, quote, not in compliance with the community's aesthetic uniformity standards, and was too large relative to neighboring properties. It gave him 10 days to remove it. He read the letter twice. He then set it down on his kitchen table and took a long breath. Then, he opened his laptop and typed 4 words into a search engine. Freedom to display American flag. The federal law. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 is a federal law, passed unanimously by both chambers of Congress and signed by the President, that explicitly prohibits any condominium association, cooperative association, or residential real estate management association from adopting or enforcing any policy that restricts or prevents a member of the association from displaying the flag of the United States on residential property within the association. That's not a gray area. That's not open to interpretation. That's federal law, and it supersedes every HOA rule in every state in the country. He printed the law. He printed the Wikipedia entry. He printed a legal explicable from a housing rights website. He stapled them together, wrote, "Please review at your earliest convenience" on the top sheet, and mailed them to the HOA board's official address. He did not remove the flag. The fallout. Susan sent a follow-up letter escalating the violation. He forwarded it to an attorney, who reached out to the board directly and used significantly more formal language about the legal exposure the board had created by attempting to enforce an illegal restriction. An emergency board meeting was called. Other residents, several of whom had apparently received aggressive enforcement letters from Susan on other matters, attended. One resident brought printed documentation showing that Susan had issued 17 violation notices in the past year, several of which appeared to be targeted at properties belonging to people she had personal disputes with. Susan was voted off the board. The vote was not close. The HOA issued a community-wide notice acknowledging that the flag restriction was legally unenforceable and apologizing for any confusion. He now flies the original flag and has added a second one, slightly larger, mounted on a new bracket he installed the week after the board meeting. He said he didn't technically need the second flag, but it felt right. We're getting close to the end now, and I want you to take a moment to appreciate something. Every person in these stories was just trying to live their life, mow their lawn, put up some lights, park their car, grow some tomatoes, hang a flag. Normal, ordinary, decent human things. Chapter 6 involves a child. Specifically, a 9-year-old girl who just wanted to practice basketball. Hoop Dad Won't Stop bought a portable basketball hoop, the kind with a weighted base that rolls, and set it up at the end of his driveway so his daughter could practice after school. She had just made the junior recreational league team. She was thrilled. He was thrilled. It was a great week. On day 4, he found a note on the hoop. The note was handwritten on cream-colored stationery, which he mentioned specifically in his post, as if the quality of the paper added a layer of absurdity to the whole thing. It said, in neat cursive, that the basketball hoop was an unsightly addition to the streetscape, that the sound of a bouncing ball was disruptive to afternoon rest periods, and that she, the neighbor, not identified by name in the note, would be filing a formal complaint with the HOA if the hoop was not removed within 72 hours. He did not remove it. She filed the complaint. The HOA sent him a letter saying the hoop violated a provision about permanent exterior structures. He wrote back pointing out that the hoop was portable, had no foundation, and could be moved by one adult in under a minute, not a permanent structure. The HOA board, apparently not used to being pushed back on, sent a second letter. This one said the hoop was likely to permanently remain in place despite its portable nature, a sentence he quoted verbatim in his Reddit post, noting it as the most impressive piece of circular logic I have ever received on official letterhead. They threatened a $150 fine for every day the hoop remained. The daughter factor. His daughter by this point knew what was happening. She was 9 years old and she was aware that someone was trying to take away the basketball hoop. She did not fully understand HOA politics. She did understand that it was unfair. She wrote a letter, handwritten, on notebook paper, with a drawing of herself shooting a basket in the corner. She addressed it to the hoop people, which is what she called the HOA board. She wrote that she had worked really hard to make the team, that she practiced every single day, and that the hoop was the only one she had. He did not send the letter. He kept it, but he photographed it. The petition. Instead, he printed a one-page petition explaining the situation: portable hoop, child's recreational use, no legitimate basis for violation, and spent 2 weekends walking the neighborhood. He knocked on 40 doors, 34 of them signed. A few people asked him to stay and talk. Several mentioned their own grievances with the HOA board's enforcement practices. One couple told him they'd been fined for having a welcome mat that was the wrong color. He called a local TV news reporter who had done a segment on HOA overreach the previous year. He mentioned he was attending the next HOA board meeting and that he'd be bringing a petition, signed by 34 of the 40 households on his street. The reporter came to the meeting. He presented the petition. He presented his documentation of the board's correspondence. He noted publicly that the HOA rulebook contained no provision specifically addressing portable recreational equipment, which meant the permanent structure interpretation was being invented to justify a decision that had already been made. The camera was rolling. The resolution. The board voted unanimously right there in the meeting to reverse the violation and formally clarify that portable recreational equipment did not fall under the permanent structures provision. His neighbor, the note writer, attempted to speak against the motion during public comment. The room was not receptive. He described the response as polite but firm, which I think is a generous characterization given what he'd been through. The TV segment ran 2 nights later. It focused on HOA overreach generally, with his story as the lead example. Several other residents from the neighborhood reached out to him afterward, sharing their own HOA frustrations. His daughter's team went on to win the regional championship that season. He drove her to every game. The hoop is still at the end of the driveway. And now we arrive at Chapter 7. I saved this one for last deliberately, because every other story in this video, as satisfying as they are, involves someone defending themselves, pushing back, winning a specific battle against a specific person. This story is different. This story is about someone who didn't just win. This story is about someone who took over the entire system. HOA Slayer Supreme, and I love that he chose that username for this story, posted his account about 18 months ago. It's one of the longest posts in our petty justice history. It has over 61,000 upvotes and more than 4,000 comments. When he finished telling the story, someone in the comments simply wrote, "This is the way. Let me tell you what happened. Ori is about someone who took over the entire system." HOA Slayer Supreme, and I love that he chose that username for this story, posted his account about 18 months ago. It's one of the longest posts in petty justice history. It has over 61,000 upvotes and more than 4,000 comments. When he finished telling the story, someone in the comments simply wrote, "This is the way. Let me tell you what happened. Year 1, the targeting begins. He moved into his house, a single-family home in a mid-sized HOA community. With his wife and their 2 young children, the house was well-maintained. He was friendly. He introduced himself to his neighbors. He paid his HOA dues on time. Within his first 6 months, he received 9 violation notices. 9 in 6 months. One was for the color of his fence. He had repainted it with a color called Navajo white, which the HOA board deemed insufficiently distinct from colonial white. Which was the approved color? They looked, by every account, including that of a professional painter he later had come out, virtually identical. One was for his mailbox, which the board said was inconsistent with community standards, despite being the same model sold at the hardware store that most of his neighbors had. One was because a guest of his had parked in front of his house 3 days in a row, not in anyone else's spot, not blocking a driveway, on the public street, in front of his own house. The fines ranged from $75 to $200 each. The pattern. He talked to his neighbors, carefully, quietly, over the course of several months. He discovered that the aggressive enforcement was not universal. Some people on his street had received no violations in years. Others, like him, had received a steady stream. The pattern, once he mapped it out, was clear. The homeowners receiving the most violations were the ones who had, at some point, pushed back on the board in any way, asked questions at meetings, voted against board initiatives, made formal complaints about anything. The enforcement wasn't about standards. It was about retaliation. He started keeping records. Every notice he received, he photographed and filed. Every interaction with the board, he followed up in writing to create a paper trail. Every fee he paid, he documented. He photographed the properties of board members and compared them against the HOA standards being enforced against him. Some of what he found was striking. One board member had a fence the same color as his, the wrong color, and had never received a notice. Another had a mailbox from the same brand he'd been fined for. A third had construction materials stored in their side yard for months without any enforcement action. 2 years of this. 2 years of fines, documentation, and quiet relationship building with neighbors who were starting to ask the same questions he was. The decision. HOA boards in most communities are elected annually by the residents. Typically, turnout is extremely low. Often a handful of votes either way determines who sits on the board. Most residents don't know the elections are happening. Most don't care, because they've never felt the board's power directed at them. He decided to run for president. He spent the month before the election doing something no previous candidate had ever done in that community. He knocked on every single door and talked to every resident willing to listen. He brought his documentation. He showed them the comparative enforcement data, the same violations treated differently depending on whether you were friendly with the board. He showed them the financial records, which revealed that a significant portion of the fine revenue was being spent on administrative costs with very little transparency about what that meant. He didn't tell people who to vote for. He just showed them what he'd found and asked them to consider whether the community they were paying for was the community they were getting. The election. Voter turnout at that year's HOA election was the highest in the community's history. Not because of some enormous total number. It was still a neighborhood, not a city. But because residents who had never voted in an HOA election showed up. People who'd been fined unfairly. People who'd watched their neighbors get fined unfairly. People who'd read his documentation and recognized the pattern. He won the presidency with 78% of the vote. Every single sitting board member who had been involved in his harassment lost their seat. The new board was made up of him, a retired accountant from down the street, a young couple who'd moved in 2 years earlier and been fined 11 times, and a woman in her 60s who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years and described the previous board as a homeowners association that didn't seem to like homeowners very much. Day 1. His first official act as president was to conduct a full audit of all outstanding fines that had been issued in the previous 2 years. Any fine that had been issued without proper procedural notice, and there were many, was dismissed. Any fine that appeared in the audit to be selectively enforced was reviewed against community standards and, where inconsistent, dismissed. 22 families had their outstanding balances cleared. Combined, that was over $14,000 in fines that simply ceased to exist. His second act was to initiate a complete rewrite of the enforcement procedures. The new framework required photographic evidence for every violation, required comparison against community standards before any notice could be issued, required 48 hours written notice before any property inspection, required that all appeals be heard by a panel that included non-board residents. His third act was to post all board meeting minutes publicly on the community website, including financial summaries, within 2 weeks of every meeting. Full transparency, no exceptions. The aftermath. Over the following 2 years, resident satisfaction with the HOA, measured through an anonymous survey he introduced, went from 31% to 84%. Fine revenue dropped significantly, not because enforcement stopped, but because genuine violations dropped once people felt the rules were being applied fairly and consistently. Several residents who had been considering selling their homes decided to stay. The community was recognized by the county as one of the best managed HOA communities in the region. They won a formal award. He gave a brief speech at the ceremony. He thanked his neighbors, the former board president, the one who had started the whole thing, with the fence color and the mailbox and the parking citations, moved out of the neighborhood about 14 months into his term. He doesn't know exactly why she left. He sent her a card when she moved. He said it was a simple, sincere note wishing her well in her new home. He was asked in the comments whether he felt bad about any of it. He said, "I didn't do anything to her. I just read the rules, made friends with my neighbors, and showed up to vote. She did everything else herself." So here's what strikes me about every single story in this video. None of these people were superheroes. None of them had particularly powerful connections. None of them spent a fortune on lawyers. They didn't go viral and use internet fame to pressure anyone. They didn't do anything dramatic or aggressive or even remotely illegal. They read the rules, they documented everything, they talked to their neighbors, they showed up when it mattered. That's it. That's the whole playbook. And every single time it worked. Because the thing about HOA Karens is that their power depends entirely on people not knowing their rights and not being willing to use them. The moment someone shows up with a printed copy of the statute, or a petition from 34 neighbors, or security camera footage, or just a letter with a lawyer's name on it, the whole thing falls apart because the rules were never actually on their side. They just assumed nobody would check, build to close. These stories remind me that knowing your rights matters. Documentation matters. Patience, frustrating, maddening, infuriating patience matters. And community matters. Because almost every person in this video won not just because of what they knew, but because of who they knew. Neighbors who signed petitions, people who showed up to meetings, residents who quietly nodded when the documentation was placed in front of them and said, "Yeah, me too." That's how this actually works. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below with the most unhinged HOA rule you've ever encountered, heard of, or lived through. Because I have a feeling the comment section on this one is going to be extraordinary. If you want more stories like these, subscribe. We do this every week. And if you enjoyed this video, share it with someone who's currently in a war with their HOA. They'll feel seen.